A simple black teenage girl walks into an upscale store, but instead of kindness, she's humiliated and kicked out because of how she looks and the color of her skin. The next day, the same store freezes when her billionaire father's Rolls-Royce pulls up to the curb. What the staff thought was a poor girl. She's the heiress to one of the biggest fashion empires in the world, and what happens next will leave the entire store speechless. What secret did she overhear that changes? And how will her father teach them a lesson they'll never forget? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. And if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. The humid August air clung to Amara's skin as she sat on the crowded bus, her school backpack perched carefully on her lap. Through the window, New York City's afternoon traffic crawled by in a haze of heat waves rising from the asphalt. Her Xavier Prep uniform shirt had come untucked hours ago, and she could feel her carefully styled edges starting to frizz in the moisture-heavy air. None of that mattered, though. Amara's attention was fixed on her phone screen, her thumb hovering over the image she'd looked at countless times before. A delicate gold necklace with a small sunflower pendant, its petals detailed with tiny diamonds that caught the light in the professional photo. The Delacour & Rowe website showed the same price it had for months. The price she'd been saving for, tucking away bits of her allowance and birthday money from her father. The necklace reminded her so much of her mother. Elena had loved sunflowers, growing them in their rooftop garden whenever the weather permitted. They always face the sun, she used to tell Amara. No matter what, they find the light. After the cancer took her mother 2 years ago, sunflowers had become Amara's private symbol of hope and remembrance. The bus lurched to a stop, and Amara glanced up to see they were just 2 blocks from Delacour & Rowe. Her heart picked up speed. She hadn't planned to go today. She was supposed to head straight home where their housekeeper, Mrs. Martinez, would be waiting with her after-school snack. But the money was burning a hole in her phone's digital wallet, and suddenly, the idea of waiting even one more day seemed impossible. Making a quick decision, Amara pulled the stop request cord. The bus wheezed to a halt at the next corner, and she stepped down onto the sidewalk, adjusting her backpack straps. The late afternoon sun beat down as she walked the 2 blocks, her patent leather school shoes clicking against the concrete. The boutique appeared ahead, its windows gleaming like diamonds themselves. Delacour & Rowe was the kind of store that made most people feel small just looking at it. The display windows showcased jewelry on elegant velvet stands, each piece spotlit to perfection. Amara slowed her steps as she approached, suddenly aware of her rumpled uniform and frizzy hair reflected in the pristine glass. She paused, tugging her shirt back into place and smoothing her hands over her hair. The girl in the reflection looked young, uncertain. Not at all like someone who belonged in a store like this. But her mother's voice echoed in her memory. "You belong anywhere you choose to be, sweet girl." Taking a deep breath, Amara pulled open the heavy glass door. Cool air conditioning washed over her as she stepped inside. The store smelled expensive, like leather and perfume and privilege. Her shoes sank into plush cream carpeting as she made her way directly to the display case she'd memorized from the website photos. And there it was, the sunflower necklace, even more beautiful in person. The gold caught the recessed lighting, making the diamond petals sparkle. Amara's fingers brushed the front pocket of her skirt where her phone held the saved money. This was it. After months of waiting, she was finally going to have this piece of her mother to wear close to her heart. A throat cleared behind her, and Amara turned to find a saleswoman watching her. The woman's blonde hair was pulled back in a severe bun, her black dress pristinely pressed. Her smile didn't reach her eyes as she looked Amara up and down. "Can I help you?" The woman's tone suggested she doubted she could. "Yes, please," Amara said, forcing herself to stand straight despite wanting to shrink under the woman's gaze. "I'm interested in the sunflower necklace." The saleswoman's perfectly penciled eyebrows rose. "That piece is quite sophisticated for someone your age. Perhaps you'd be more interested in our youth collection? Or I could suggest some more appropriate stores at Jefferson Mall." Heat crept up Amara's neck, but before she could respond, the boutique's door chimed. A white couple walked in, the woman in designer yoga wear and the man in a business suit. The saleswoman's demeanor transformed instantly. "Welcome to Delacour and Row." She turned her back fully to Amara, gesturing warmly to the couple. "Would you care for some champagne while you browse?" Amara stood frozen, her earlier excitement crumbling into something heavy and familiar in her stomach. She'd felt this before, in upscale restaurants with her father, in boutiques with her friends, in too many places to count. The judgment, the assumptions, the dismissal of her very presence. Slowly, she took a step back from the display case, then another. The saleswoman didn't even glance her way, too busy fawning over the couple. But as Amara neared the door, the woman's voice rang out sharp and clear. "We have cameras everywhere, just so you know." The words hit like a physical blow. Amara pushed through the door out into the humid air that now felt like it was choking her. Her vision blurred as tears welled up, but she blinked them back furiously. She wouldn't cry. Not here. Not where they could see. Her shoes clicked faster now on the sidewalk as she walked away from the store, away from the beautiful sunflower necklace, away from another place that had made it clear she didn't belong, no matter who she was or what she could afford. Amara walked down the sidewalk, her feet heavy with each step. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the pavement, but she barely noticed, keeping her eyes fixed on the ground. Around her, New York City continued its endless rush, people hurrying past, cars honking, the constant pulse of urban life. But she felt disconnected from it all, as if watching through thick glass. Her phone felt like a lead weight in her hand as she pulled it out. The screen reflected her face for a moment before she unlocked it, and she quickly looked away from her own reflection. Opening her messages, she typed out a text to her father. "Home late. Went by the store. Not buying today." Her thumb hovered over the send button for a moment. There was so much more she could say, so many words crowding her throat about what had really happened. About the way the saleswoman had looked at her, about the familiar sting of being treated like she didn't belong. But she pressed send without adding anything else. The response came quickly, a thumbs-up emoji followed by a heart. Typical dad, she thought, with a mixture of affection and resignation. Always responding, always showing love, but usually distracted by the endless demands of running his empire. She could picture him now, probably in the middle of some important meeting, firing off quick responses between business decisions. The heat pressed down on her shoulders as she walked, making her uniform stick to her skin. Up ahead, a familiar bodega's awning offered a splash of shade. The bell chimed softly as she pushed open the door, and cool air washed over her. Mr. Rodriguez, the owner who'd known her since she was small, nodded from behind the counter. "Usual, Amara?" he asked, already reaching for the peach iced tea she often bought. "Yes, please," she replied, managing a small smile. Here, at least, she was just Amara. Not a suspicious teenager, not a billionaire's daughter, just a regular customer who liked peach iced tea. She handed over $2, the transaction simple and dignified, so different from what she'd experienced earlier. The cold bottle felt good in her hand as she stepped back outside. Across the street, an empty bench sat in the shade of a large oak tree. Amara made her way over and sat down, pulling her headphones from her backpack. She plugged them into her phone and settled them over her ears, but didn't play any music. It was a trick she'd learned years ago, a way to be alone in public, to observe without invitation for interaction. The world moved past her in its usual Thursday afternoon rhythm. Office workers heading to early dinner meetings, students from other schools making their way home, tourists consulting their phones for directions. A young black girl walked past holding tight to her mother's hand. She couldn't have been more than 7 or 8, wearing bright yellow barrettes in her hair and light-up sneakers. The girl slowed as they passed a clothing store, tugging on her mother's hand to stop and stare at a sparkly dress in the window display. Her face pressed close to the glass, eyes wide with wonder. Something twisted in Amara's chest. She remembered being that age, standing outside fancy stores with her own mother, dreaming about beautiful things. Elena had always made her feel like she deserved to be anywhere, to want anything. "The world is yours too, baby," she used to say. But the world had other ideas, as today had proved yet again. The girl and her mother moved on, but Amara stayed on the bench until her iced tea was gone, and the shadows had stretched even longer across the sidewalk. Finally, she stood up and began the walk home, her steps slow and heavy with thoughts she couldn't quite shake. The Vasseur penthouse was quiet when she arrived, save for the gentle humming of Mrs. Martinez in the kitchen. Delicious smells wafted through the apartment: garlic, herbs, the comfort of a home-cooked meal. Amara changed out of her uniform and went through the motions of her evening routine, barely noticing what she was doing. At 7 o'clock, she sat across from her father at their massive dining room table. Malik Vasseur's attention was split between his tablet, his dinner plate, and his phone, his fingers moving rapidly as he responded to what seemed like endless emails. The soft blue light from his devices cast shadows across his face, making him look older than his 45 years. Amara pushed her food around her plate, the earlier events of the day sitting heavy in her stomach. The classical music playing softly through the apartment's speaker system felt too formal, too proper for the messy thoughts swirling in her head. She watched her father work, wondering if he ever faced the same things she did. But no, people knew his face, his name. They wouldn't dare treat Malik Vasseur the way that saleswoman had treated his daughter. "Do you think," she started, then paused, considering her words carefully. "Do you think people treat us different when they don't know who you are?" The typing stopped. Malik looked up from his tablet, his dark eyes sharp and suddenly focused entirely on her. The question seemed to hang in the air between them, heavy with unspoken weight. "What happened?" he asked, his voice quiet but intense. She recognized that tone. It was the same one he used in business meetings when something important had caught his attention. Amara shrugged, trying to make it seem casual even as her throat tightened with the memory. "Nothing major, just people show their real face when they think you don't matter." Her father's eyes narrowed and she saw something flash across his face. Recognition, perhaps, or remembered pain. The expression was gone quickly, replaced by the careful neutrality he usually maintained. But Amara knew he understood exactly what she wasn't saying. The morning sun streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Vasseur Atelier's executive floor, casting long shadows across Malik Vasseur's desk. He sat in his leather chair, one hand holding his phone to his ear while the other tapped rapidly on his laptop keyboard. Fashion Week preparations were reaching their peak, and his inbox was overflowing with urgent requests and last-minute changes. "Yes, tell Milan we can accommodate the schedule change, but Paris needs to remain as planned," he said into the phone, his voice carrying the quiet authority that had become his trademark. "And make sure the lighting team understands my specifications for the runway. No compromises on that." But even as he moved through his morning routine of calls and emails, Amara's words from the previous night kept surfacing in his mind. "People show their real face when they think you don't matter." The way she'd said it, so matter-of-fact, so resigned, bothered him more than any angry outburst would have. It reminded him too much of his own youth, of lessons learned the hard way about how the world saw him before he had the power to make it see differently. Malik glanced at the framed photo on his desk. Elena and 8-year-old Amara at the beach, both laughing as waves crashed behind them. Elena had always known how to handle these moments better than he did. She would have known exactly what to say to their daughter. He pulled up his schedule for the day. Back-to-back meetings until 6, then dinner with potential investors. His finger hovered over the screen for a moment before he pressed the intercom button. "Janet, get me Marcus on the line," he said to his assistant. A few moments later, his driver's voice came through the speaker. "Yes, Mr. Vasseur? Clear my schedule from 2 to 4 this afternoon. Something's come up that needs my attention." Meanwhile, across town, Amara sat in her AP history class, her notebook open but empty in front of her. The teacher's voice faded into background noise as she stared out the window, her mind replaying yesterday's scene at the jewelry store. The way the saleswoman's smile hadn't reached her eyes, the careful way she'd positioned herself between Amara and the display cases, the casual cruelty of her dismissal. The bell rang, startling her out of her thoughts. As students filed out for lunch, she gathered her things slowly, in no hurry to join the usual cafeteria chaos. In the courtyard, Danny was already at their usual table, her wild curls pulled back in a colorful scarf. She waved as Amara approached, then frowned when she saw her friend's expression. Okay, spill, Danny said as Amara sat down. You've been walking around like a zombie all morning. What's going on? Amara picked at her lunch, not meeting Danny's eyes. It's nothing, just something stupid that happened yesterday. Girl, don't even try that with me. I know you're nothing face and this isn't it. Danny leaned forward, her voice softening. Come on, talk to me. Amara sighed, then told her about the jewelry store, about wanting to buy something special to remember her mom, about the saleswoman's thinly veiled accusations and the champagne offered to other customers. With each detail, Danny's expression grew darker. Oh, hell no, Danny interrupted, her voice rising. Please tell me you got that racist's name. Your dad could buy that whole store and fire her. Danny, stop. Amara shook her head. It's not the first time. Won't be the last. She took a bite of her sandwich, chewing slowly. Besides, what good would it do? They'd just say they were following protocol or something. They always do. Back at Vasseur Atelier, Malik sat at his desk, his eyes fixed on his computer screen. The security footage from yesterday afternoon played silently before him, showing the street outside Delacour and Row. His company maintained cameras throughout the luxury shopping district, standard practice for monitoring brand showcases and store security. He watched as Amara approached the store, noticed her hesitation before entering. Even from this distance, he could read the hope in her posture, the way she'd straightened her uniform and checked her reflection. His daughter having to gather courage just to walk into a store. The footage switched to another angle as she emerged minutes later, her head down, walking quickly away from the store. Malik's jaw tightened. He'd seen that walk before, on Elena, on himself, on countless others who'd been made to feel they didn't belong in spaces that should have been open to everyone. He pressed a button on his desk phone. Janet, get me the contact information for Delacour and Rose Management, and clear my afternoon as discussed. Right away, Mr. Vasseur, Janet replied. And, sir? Ms. Chen from marketing is here for your 11 o'clock. Send her in. He closed the security footage and straightened his tie, his mind already forming plans. In the school courtyard, Amara's phone buzzed with a message from Danny. You sure you're okay? Amara stared at the text for a long moment, thinking about all the times she'd said she was fine when she wasn't. All the times she'd swallowed her hurt and anger because it was easier than explaining. All the times she'd made herself small to make others comfortable. Her fingers moved across the screen. Yeah, just tired of being invisible. She sent the message and looked up at the sky, watching clouds drift past the school buildings. Her mother used to say that art was about making the invisible visible, about helping people see what they usually looked past. Maybe that's why the sunflower necklace had meant so much. It wasn't just jewelry. It was a connection to that part of her mother's legacy. Across town, Malik ended his call with Janet, who had arranged his visit to the store. Not in anger. He'd learned long ago that anger, however justified, rarely achieved the results he wanted. No, he would go in calm and composed, letting them show their true colors without knowing who he was. Let them reveal themselves again, just as they had to his daughter. His phone buzzed with a meeting reminder, but for once, he didn't immediately reach for it. Instead, he looked again at the photo of Elena and Amara, remembering something his wife had told him years ago. Our daughter shouldn't have to be extraordinary just to be treated like a person. He'd agreed then, but somehow in his drive to protect Amara with privilege and position, he'd forgotten that truth. Yesterday, she'd walked into that store not as Malik Vasseur's daughter, but simply as herself, and that should have been enough. The final bell rang through the halls of St. Catherine's Preparatory, and students poured out of the building into the humid afternoon air. Amara walked beside Danny, both of them moving at their usual unhurried pace discussing their English assignment. I still can't believe Mrs. Peterson expects us to read all of Pride and Prejudice by Monday, Danny complained, adjusting her backpack strap. Like, doesn't she know we have other classes? Amara was about to respond when she noticed something unusual at the bottom of the school's stone steps. There, parked directly in front of the school entrance, was her father's matte black Rolls-Royce Phantom. Marcus, their chauffeur, stood beside it in his crisp black suit, hands clasped professionally in front of him. Danny stopped mid-step, her mouth falling open. "Girl," she said, eyes wide as saucers. "What's going on?" Amara felt heat rise to her cheeks as other students slowed their pace to stare at the luxury vehicle. She wasn't used to this kind of attention. Her father usually kept things low-key, letting her take the bus like any other student. "My dad's being extra," Amara muttered, trying to sound casual, even as her stomach twisted with uncertainty. Her father never sent the car unless something important was happening. "Extra?" Danny laughed. "Girl, this is beyond extra. This is like extra with a side of extra." She nudged Amara's shoulder. "Text me later, okay? I want all the details." Marcus opened the rear door as Amara approached, giving her a gentle smile. "Good afternoon, Miss Vasseur." The leather seats were cool against her legs as she slid in, placing her backpack beside her. The car's interior smelled of leather and her father's favorite sandalwood air freshener. As they pulled away from the curb, Amara noticed her classmates still staring, phones raised to capture the moment. The city passed by outside the tinted windows as Marcus navigated through afternoon traffic. Amara sat in silence, her hands folded in her lap, wondering what her father had planned. They weren't heading in the direction of home or his office. When the car finally came to a stop, Amara's heart plummeted to her stomach. Through the window, she could see the familiar gleaming facade of Delacour and Rowe. The same windows she'd looked through yesterday, the same door she'd walked out of fighting tears. Before she could voice her protest, the door beside her opened. Her father stood there impeccable in a charcoal gray suit, his presence commanding even in silence. His expression was neutral, but Amara knew him well enough to see the tension in his jaw, the careful control in his movements. "Come with me," he said quietly, extending his hand to help her out of the car. Amara hesitated for a moment, then took his hand. Her school shoes clicked against the sidewalk as she stood, suddenly very aware of her uniform, her slightly frizzy hair, how young she must look next to her father's polished presence. They walked into the store together, Malik's hand resting lightly on her shoulder. The boutique looked different in the afternoon light, brighter, less intimidating. Or maybe it was just her father's presence that made it feel that way. The effect of their entrance was immediate. The staff, who had been arranging displays and chatting quietly, snapped to attention. Amara spotted the clerk from yesterday, the one who had dismissed her so casually. The woman's eyes moved from Amara to Malik, confusion clouding her features as she tried to make sense of their presence. A man in an expensive suit hurried forward, recognition dawning on his face as he looked at Malik. "Mr. Vasseur," he said, his voice carrying a hint of nervousness. "What an unexpected pleasure. I'm James Morton, the store manager. How can we assist you today?" The clerk's face had gone pale, her earlier confusion replaced by growing realization. She took a small step forward, hands clasped tightly in front of her, but Malik's attention remained fixed on the manager. "I hear you had trouble with my daughter yesterday," Malik said, his voice calm but carrying an edge that made everyone in the store stand a little straighter. The clerk stumbled forward, her rehearsed apology already forming on her lips. "Sir, I can explain." Malik raised his hand, silencing her mid-sentence. When he spoke, his voice was measured, deliberate. It wasn't the voice of the billionaire owner of Vasseur Atelier, the voice that commanded boardrooms and shaped the luxury fashion industry. This was the voice of a black father who had seen his child hurt one too many times. Amara watched her father, standing tall and dignified in the middle of the store that had made her feel so small just yesterday. She didn't feel vindicated. Not yet. But something else was building inside her as she watched her father prepare to speak, something that felt like a mix of pride and understanding. The store had gone completely silent. Even the soft background music seemed to have faded away, as if the building itself was holding its breath, waiting to hear what Malik Vasseur would say to defend his daughter's dignity. The jewelry store fell into a heavy silence, broken only by the soft hum of the air conditioning and the distant sounds of traffic filtering through the thick glass windows. The clerk's face had gone from pale to flushed, her hands fidgeting with the hem of her designer blazer as she took another hesitant step forward, clearly uncomfortable under the weight of what was unfolding. "Mr. Vasseur, I didn't know she was your daughter." Her voice quavered, the words hanging awkwardly in the air between them, like an apology that only confirmed the underlying problem. Malik didn't even turn to look at her. His attention remained fixed on the store manager, his expression composed but carrying the weight of years of similar encounters, similar excuses. "That's the point," he said, his voice low but clear enough to carry through the hushed store, each word deliberate and measured. A couple browsing engagement rings suddenly became very interested in their phones, though their eyes kept darting toward the scene unfolding before them. An elderly woman pretended to examine a display of watches, her head tilted just so to catch every word. Even the security guard by the door had shifted his position slightly, trying to appear professional while clearly hanging on every word, his stance betraying his interest. Amara stood slightly behind her father, her school uniform feeling both like armor and a target. She watched as the manager's professional smile strained at the edges, his eyes darting between Malik and the growing audience of customers who had abandoned any pretense of not listening. The familiar knot of discomfort tightened in her stomach, the same feeling she'd had yesterday when all eyes had followed her movements through the store. "Mr. Vasseur," the manager began, adjusting his tie with manicured fingers, a thin sheen of sweat visible on his forehead. "I assure you that if there was any misunderstanding yesterday—" "Misunderstanding?" Malik's voice remained steady, but there was a sharp edge to it now, like a perfectly polished blade. "Let's be very clear about what happened in your store yesterday." He gestured to the space around them, taking in the gleaming display cases and crystal chandeliers that sparkled overhead. "My daughter walked in here just like any other customer. She came to look at a specific piece, a sunflower necklace she's been saving for. For months, she set aside her allowance for something special." The manager shifted uncomfortably as Malik continued, his words precise and measured, each one landing with quiet force. "But that's not how your staff saw her, is it? They didn't see a young woman interested in making a purchase. They saw someone who didn't belong." "Mr. Vasseur," the manager interjected, his professional demeanor cracking slightly, beads of sweat now visible on his upper lip. "I can assure you that Delacour and Rowe values all our customers. We have a very diverse clientele." "Stop." Malik's command was quiet but absolute, silencing the room instantly. "Don't tell me about your diverse clientele. Don't show me your corporate inclusion statement. Tell me why my daughter was treated like a potential thief instead of a potential customer." The silence in the store grew thicker, almost suffocating. A young sales associate near the back had frozen in place, a jewelry box half opened in her hands, her eyes wide with discomfort. The couple looking at engagement rings had given up all pretense of not listening, their phones forgotten in their hands as they watched the scene unfold. "You treated her like she didn't belong," Malik continued, his voice carrying the weight of countless similar experiences. A lifetime of moments just like this one. Because she was young, because she was black, because she didn't come in waving a platinum card. His words fell like perfectly aimed arrows, each one finding its mark in the uncomfortable truth. "You made assumptions based on what you saw, a young black girl in a school uniform, and those assumptions led your staff to treat my daughter like a criminal instead of a customer." The manager's face had grown increasingly uncomfortable, the redness creeping up from his collar to his cheeks. He opened his mouth to speak, then closed it again, seemingly at a loss for words. The clerk who had confronted Amara yesterday stood slightly behind him, her eyes fixed on the floor, shoulders hunched as if trying to disappear. Amara shifted her weight from one foot to the other, feeling the weight of everyone's attention like a physical pressure. It wasn't the confrontation itself that made her uncomfortable. She'd seen her father handle difficult situations with this same controlled precision before. It was the feeling of being exposed, of having her private hurt laid bare in front of strangers. The memory of yesterday's humiliation felt raw again, despite her father's protective presence beside her. As her eyes wandered around the store, trying to avoid the stares of the other customers, Amara noticed something on the clerk's desk. The woman's phone lay face up, and in the clear case was a photo, A teenage girl with long blonde hair, wearing what looked like a dance costume, her pose suggesting a recital or competition. She appeared to be about Amara's age, her smile bright and carefree, untouched by the kind of experience Amara was currently living through. The clerk followed Amara's gaze to the phone, and their eyes met for a brief moment. Something shifted in the woman's expression, not quite recognition, but perhaps the beginning of understanding, a crack in the wall of assumptions that had separated them yesterday. Amara took a small step forward, her voice quiet but clear in the tense atmosphere. "Does your daughter like sunflowers?" The unexpected question seemed to catch everyone off guard. The clerk blinked, her rehearsed professional mask cracking to reveal genuine surprise, her lips parting slightly. The manager turned to look at Amara, his brow furrowed in confusion at this sudden change in direction, clearly thrown by the simple, human question that cut through the tension. The jewelry store seemed to hold its breath as Amara's question hung in the air. The clerk's professional facade crumbled further, replaced by genuine confusion and vulnerability. Her fingers twitched against her designer blazer as she struggled to process the unexpected query. "Yes, how do you know that?" the clerk stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. The carefully maintained distance between employee and customer dissolved in her surprise. Amara's eyes flickered to the sunflower necklace in the display case, then back to the clerk. "She mentioned it. You were crying on the phone. I heard." Her voice was soft but clear, carrying easily in the hushed store. The revelation landed like a stone in still water, rippling through the space. Yesterday, while being watched like a potential thief, Amara had witnessed a private moment, a mother's worry, a daughter's dreams. The other customers shifted uncomfortably, perhaps recognizing the layers of irony in the situation. The clerk's face drained of color as recognition dawned. She remembered the phone call, her daughter's excitement about college acceptance letters, mixed with their shared anxiety about tuition costs. She'd stepped away from the counter, thinking herself alone in the store except for that young black girl she'd been so quick to judge. Malik stood quietly, his presence commanding but not threatening. With deliberate movements, he reached into his leather briefcase and withdrew a cream-colored folder, its surface embossed with the Vasseur Foundation logo in subtle silver. From within, he extracted a sealed envelope, heavy with official weight and significance. The fluorescent lights caught the expensive paper as he extended it toward the clerk, who stared at it as if it might burn her. Her hands trembled slightly as she accepted it, uncertainty written across her features. "What is this?" she asked, her voice barely audible. The other employees had drawn closer, unable to resist the pull of the unfolding scene. The security guard by the door had abandoned any pretense of professional distance, watching with undisguised curiosity. Even the manager seemed to have forgotten his attempt to maintain control of the situation. With hesitant fingers, the clerk broke the seal and opened the envelope. The paper inside was thick, official, bearing both the Vasseur Foundation letterhead and the unmistakable formatting of a formal document. Her eyes widened as she began to read, then filled with tears. "This is..." She had to stop, collect herself. "This is for my daughter?" The scholarship certificate spelled it out in clear, unambiguous terms. 4 years of college education, fully funded. Tuition, housing, books, everything a student would need to pursue their dreams without the weight of financial burden. The amount listed made the clerk's hands shake harder. Malik's response cut through the air with quiet precision. "She didn't ask to inherit your ignorance." The words weren't cruel, but they carried the weight of truth. The clerk's tears began to fall in earnest now. Not the dramatic sobs of someone seeking sympathy, but the quiet, burning tears of someone facing their own reflection and finding it wanting. She pressed one hand to her mouth, the scholarship certificate trembling in her other hand. Around them, the store had gone completely still. The couple who had been pretending not to listen now watched openly, their own shopping forgotten. The manager stood frozen, his carefully maintained expression of professional concern cracking around the edges. Even the security guard looked away, perhaps seeing something of his own behavior reflected in this moment. Amara stood beside her father, her posture straight but not rigid. There was no triumph in her expression, no satisfaction in the clerk's distress. Instead, she carried herself with the quiet dignity that her mother had always taught her was more powerful than anger. "I helped her," Amara said, her voice carrying the same steady strength as her father's. "Because she deserves a future, not because you deserve forgiveness." The words settled into the silence like stones at the bottom of a pond. The clerk's tears continued to fall, but she met Amara's gaze directly for the first time, not as a suspicious employee watching a potential thief, but as a human being seeing another human being clearly. Malik's hand came to rest gently on Amara's shoulder, a gesture of both protection and pride. The weight of it seemed to ground her, connecting her to generations of strength and resilience that had brought them to this moment. Then Malik turned to the manager, whose attempt at maintaining professional composure had long since crumbled. "Now," Malik said, his tone shifting to something harder, more businesslike, "let's talk about the consequences." The word consequences seemed to echo in the store's expensive silence. The manager swallowed hard, suddenly very aware that he was facing not just a disgruntled customer, but Malik Vasseur, a man whose influence in the luxury retail world could reshape destinies with a single phone call. The clerk stood clutching the scholarship certificate, tears still tracking silently down her face, as father and daughter presented a united front that spoke of both power and principle. The sunflower necklace gleamed quietly in its display case, no longer just a piece of jewelry, but a symbol of something much more profound, a lesson about judgment, consequences, and the choice between perpetuating harm or creating change. The tension in the jewelry store crystallized into something sharp and brittle. The manager's complexion, already uncomfortable, drained to a sickly pale as he processed Malik's words about consequences. His perfectly pressed suit suddenly seemed to hang awkwardly on his frame as he stepped forward, hands raised in a placating gesture. "Mr. Vasseur, surely this can be resolved," he began, his voice carrying the practiced smoothness of someone accustomed to dealing with wealthy clients. Malik cut through the attempt at diplomacy with the same quiet precision he'd shown throughout the encounter. His voice remained measured, neither raised nor aggressive, but carrying a finality that seemed to lower the temperature in the room. Effective immediately, Vasseur Atelier severs all partnerships with Delacour and Rowe, globally. The word globally landed like a hammer strike. The manager's professional veneer cracked completely, revealing the panic underneath. His eyes darted around the store, to the watching customers, to his staff, to the security cameras that had been meant to intimidate Amara, but were now recording his own undoing. "Mr. Vasseur," he started again, his voice taking on an edge of desperation. "We have contracts, exclusive showcases planned for next season. The Fashion Week collection is already in production. We've been partners for 7 years, Malik finished for him, still unblinking. "I know exactly how long we've been partners. I know exactly what we've built together." He paused, letting the weight of that history settle. "And I know exactly what I'm walking away from." The manager began shuffling through mental calculations, his hands making small, agitated movements. "The spring showcase alone, the logistics are already in motion. The marketing campaign, double quotes. You'll receive a formal breach letter by Monday," Malik stated, as if the manager hadn't spoken. "Your store will no longer carry our brand. Anywhere." The magnitude of this declaration seemed to ripple through the store. The other employees exchanged glances, understanding the implications. Vasseur Atelier wasn't just any luxury brand. It was the cornerstone of modern high fashion, the name that carried weight in every major market globally. Behind her counter, the clerk's tears fell harder now. These weren't the tears of guilt or shame from moments before. These were the tears of someone watching their livelihood crumble in real time. She knew what the loss of the Vasseur partnership would mean for the store, for her commission-based salary, for her ability to pay for basic necessities even with her daughter's education now secured. The manager's desperation peaked. "Please, Mr. Vasseur, we can implement new training programs, diversity initiatives, whatever you think is appropriate." "Whatever I think is appropriate." Malik repeated the words back, letting their hollow ring fill the space. "You mean whatever will make this go away quietly?" The silence that followed was deafening. Even the usual sounds of the store, The soft music, the hum of climate control, the distant street noise, seemed muted, as if the space itself was holding its breath. Amara stood quietly beside her father, watching it all unfold. Her presence was a reminder of why they were here, not for revenge, but for justice. Not for show, but for change. Her eyes met those of the clerk briefly, and something passed between them. An understanding, perhaps, or a recognition of how moments of casual cruelty could spiral into consequences neither party had anticipated. Malik turned toward the entrance, his movement deliberate and unhurried. Amara fell into step beside him, their footsteps echoing on the polished floor. The other customers parted before them, some averting their eyes, others watching with undisguised fascination. At the door, Malik paused. He turned back, not just to the manager but to everyone in the store. His voice carried easily in the silence, each word clear and measured. "You only respect black when it wears a label you recognize. That's your failure, not ours." The truth of it hung in the air like smoke. The manager stood frozen. The clerk clutched her daughter's scholarship with trembling hands, and the other employees seemed to shrink into themselves, perhaps recognizing their own complicity in the system they served. Father and daughter walked out together. There were no cameras waiting outside, no reporters clamoring for statements. The street continued its usual rhythm, unaware of the seismic shift that had just occurred behind the boutique's gleaming windows. Their exit was marked only by the soft chime of the door's bell and the quiet confidence of their steps on the sidewalk. The power of their departure lay not in its volume, but in its certainty. No media circus was needed to amplify their message. No fanfare was required to underscore their impact. They had wielded their influence with the same quiet dignity that Amara had shown in the face of discrimination, and that Malik had cultivated throughout his rise to success. As they left Delacour and Rowe behind, the store's pristine interior seemed suddenly hollow, its luxury tarnished by the revelation of its true character. The sunlight caught the store's windows, turning them into mirrors that reflected back the uncomfortable truth of what had transpired within. The late afternoon sun stretched their shadows long across the pristine sidewalk of Fifth Avenue as Amara and Malik walked away from Delacour and Rowe. The familiar weight of silence hung between them, but it was different now, thoughtful rather than heavy. Amara's steps were measured, her mind still processing the events that had unfolded inside the store. The street hummed with its usual symphony of luxury car engines, clicking heels and distant sirens. Well-dressed shoppers moved past them, some doing double takes as they recognized Malik Vassar, but father and daughter remained in their own bubble of quiet reflection. A flash of movement across the street caught Amara's attention. She slowed her pace, then stopped completely. Through the stream of yellow taxis and sleek town cars, she spotted a little black girl, maybe 7 or 8, standing pressed against a store window. The child's braids caught the sunlight, decorated with bright plastic beads that clicked together as she bounced on her toes. Beside her, a woman who had to be her mother stood watching, her expression a familiar mix of patience and resignation. Amara's gaze followed the little girl's line of sight to what had captured her attention. A sunflower necklace, nearly identical to the one from Delacour and Rowe, gleaming behind the pristine glass. The price tag was just as intimidating, but the girl's eyes sparkled with pure wonder, untainted by any knowledge of social barriers or prejudice. Something stirred in Amara's chest, a memory of herself at that age, holding her mother's hand, dreaming without limits before the world had taught her to expect closed doors and suspicious glances. Her hand moved to her pocket, where she felt the soft velvet of a small pouch that Malik had pressed into her palm earlier. She remembered the moment clearly. Sitting in the car before confronting the store, her father had quietly produced the pouch containing the very necklace she'd been saving for. He hadn't made a show of it, hadn't even mentioned it. He'd simply placed it in her hand with a gentle squeeze, his eyes forward, letting the gesture speak for itself. The necklace she'd wanted for months, the one that reminded her of her mother's favorite flower, was finally hers, but somehow that didn't feel like the end of its story. "Dad," Amara said softly, her eyes still on the little girl across the street. "Give me a minute." Malik followed her gaze and nodded, understanding flickering across his features. He stood back, watchful, but allowing his daughter this moment that was entirely her own. Amara waited for the traffic signal, then crossed the street with purpose. As she approached, she could hear the little girl chattering excitedly to her mother about the necklace, pointing out how the petals caught the light, how real it looked. "But baby," the mother was saying gently, "we can look at it another day. We need to get home for dinner." Amara knelt beside the girl, bringing herself to eye level. The child turned, surprised by her presence but not shy. "You like this one?" Amara asked, smiling warmly. The girl nodded, her beads clicking together again. Her eyes were wide with wonder, not just at the necklace now, but at this teenager who looked like her, who was speaking to her like she mattered. "It's pretty," the girl said, "like real sunshine." Amara reached into her pocket and pulled out the velvet pouch. The mother tensed slightly, protective instinct kicking in, but Amara's gentle demeanor kept her from pulling her daughter away. "Here," Amara said, pressing the pouch into the little girl's hand. The child's fingers curled around it automatically, her expression a mix of confusion and growing excitement. "No one should ever be told what they don't deserve before they've even asked," Amara said softly, the words carrying the weight of her own experience, but also the lightness of breaking free from it. The mother stepped forward, already shaking her head. "Oh no, we couldn't possibly." "It's already paid for," Amara interrupted gently, standing up. She smiled at the mother, trying to convey everything she couldn't say out loud, about worth, about dignity, about breaking cycles of expectation. The little girl had opened the pouch and was gasping at the golden sunflower nestled inside. Her mother's protests died on her lips as she watched her daughter's face transform with joy. "Thank you," the girl whispered, clutching the necklace to her chest. "Thank you." Amara touched the girl's shoulder lightly, then turned to walk back to where her father waited. As she crossed the street, she heard the excited chatter resume behind her, now filled with disbelief and delight. She had almost reached the car when a woman in a sharp blazer stepped into her path, press badge glinting in the late afternoon sun. A photographer hovered nearby, camera already raised. "Ms. Vasseur, can we get a quote?" the reporter asked, voice eager, pen poised over a notepad. "About what happened inside Delacour and Rowe?" Amara paused, one hand on the car door. She considered the reporter's question, thought about everything that had transpired, the humiliation, the confrontation, the consequences, and now, this small act of passing on kindness. She rolled down the window just enough to speak through the gap. "No need," she said simply. "The lesson's already been taught." The car pulled away smoothly, merging into the flow of traffic on Fifth Avenue. In the rearview mirror, Amara could see the little girl still standing on the sidewalk, the sunflower necklace now around her neck, catching the last rays of afternoon sun. The sight made something warm bloom in her chest. Not victory exactly, but something gentler, something that felt like hope. The Rolls-Royce purred to a stop in the private garage beneath their building, the sound echoing off concrete walls. Through tinted windows, Amara watched as their regular doorman, Marcus, approached with his characteristic warm smile. He opened the car door with a flourish, tipping his hat as she stepped out. "Welcome home, Miss Vasseur," he said cheerfully, completely unaware of the afternoon's events. His familiar greeting felt strange now, like a reminder of how quickly the world moved on, while everything inside her still churned. Malik emerged from the other side, nodding to Marcus as he always did. In the elevator, father and daughter stood in comfortable silence, both lost in their own thoughts as they ascended to the penthouse floor. The soft classical music playing through hidden speakers seemed almost comically removed from the weight of what had transpired hours before. Amara watched the floor numbers tick upward, each one bringing her closer to the sanctuary she desperately needed. When the elevator doors opened directly into their home, Amara didn't pause in the soaring entryway with its carefully curated art collection. She didn't stop to admire the wall of windows showcasing the glittering Manhattan skyline, or the fresh flowers their housekeeper always arranged in tall crystal vases. Instead, she walked straight through the sprawling living room, her school shoes silent against the herringbone hardwood floors. "I'm going to my room," she said quietly, not turning back to look at her father. It wasn't that she was upset with him, far from it. She just needed space to process, to let the day settle into something she could understand. The weight of the afternoon sat heavy on her shoulders, demanding to be unpacked in private. Malik watched her go, understanding in his eyes. He didn't call after her or try to start a conversation. He knew his daughter well enough to recognize when she needed solitude. Some lessons couldn't be taught with words. They required reflection and the gentle passage of time. Amara's bedroom door closed with a soft click behind her. The space was her sanctuary, walls covered in her own artwork and photos of her mother. Elena's influence was everywhere, in the vintage camera collection on floating shelves, in the easel by the window, in the way warm afternoon light painted everything in gold, just as Elena had always loved it. The room embraced her like an old friend who already knew her secrets. Meanwhile, Malik moved through the kitchen with practiced ease. He selected a bottle of wine from their temperature-controlled wall unit, a Bordeaux that Elena had loved. The cork came free with a soft pop that seemed too loud in the quiet apartment. He poured a single glass, the rich red liquid catching the light like rubies, swirling with memories of happier evenings. Settling onto one of the high-backed stools at the kitchen island, Malik pulled out his phone. The screen illuminated with notifications, but his eyes fixed on one particular email from Sandra Chen, head of Vasseur Atelier's legal department. The subject line was simple: Delacour and Rowe, contract termination status. The message confirmed what he already knew would happen. The process had begun. Years of partnership, millions in revenue, countless Fashion Week showcases, all of it ending because of a single afternoon of truth. He didn't regret it. Not for a second, but he didn't feel triumphant either. This victory tasted bittersweet, like most battles worth fighting. Malik didn't type out a response. He just stared at the screen, then set the phone face down on the marble countertop. The wine in his glass remained untouched as his mind wandered through memories. Elena teaching a young Amara to paint, explaining how art could speak louder than words. His own mother warning him that success wouldn't shield him or his children from certain realities. The look in Amara's eyes when she'd given away that necklace. Not defeat, but something stronger, something that reminded him so much of Elena it made his chest ache. In her room, Amara sat cross-legged on her window seat, her favorite sketchbook open in her lap. The leather-bound book had been a gift from her mother on her 13th birthday, the pages thick and cream-colored, perfect for both drawing and writing. She ran her fingers over the smooth paper, then picked up her favorite drawing pencil, its wooden surface worn smooth from countless hours in her hand. The sunflower began to take shape under her careful strokes. First, the center, a perfect spiral of seeds. Then the petals, reaching outward like rays of sun. The chain emerged next, delicate links catching imaginary light. She worked slowly, deliberately, adding details that made the piece feel real. The slight texture of the metal, the way certain petals curved more than others, the subtle shadows that gave it depth and life. Then, with careful precision, she added something unexpected, a single crack running down the center of the flower. Not jagged or violent, but clean and purposeful. The crack didn't split the flower apart. It didn't destroy the beauty. Instead, it seemed to add character like a story etched into metal, a testament to survival. Amara sat back studying her work. The cracked sunflower seemed to hold all the contradictions of the day: strength and vulnerability, beauty and imperfection, hurt and healing. In the bottom corner of the page, she picked up her pen and wrote in her neat handwriting, "Not everything loud has to be heard." The words felt right somehow. They captured what she'd learned, that sometimes the quietest actions spoke the loudest truths, that power didn't always need to announce itself, that change could come from gentle hands as easily as raised voices. As the evening light softened around her, Amara felt something settle within her, not resolution exactly, but the beginning of understanding. The Monday morning sun streamed through the tall windows of Wellington Prep's historic hallways, casting long rectangles of light across the polished floors. Students clustered in small groups, heads bent over phones, voices rising and falling like waves. The usual Monday morning complaints about weekend homework and upcoming tests had been replaced by something else entirely. Amara noticed the change the moment she stepped through the heavy wooden doors. Conversations stuttered to a halt as she passed. Eyes darted away when she looked up, but as soon as she was just out of earshot, the whispers would start again like rustling leaves in autumn. Someone had posted a photo on social media. It wasn't even a particularly good one, just a slightly blurry shot of her and her father leaving Delacour and Row on Friday afternoon. But it was the caption that had set everything on fire. "That's Vasseur's daughter?" 3 question marks, like her identity was some kind of shocking plot twist in a movie everyone had been watching without knowing the ending. The photo had spread through the school's social circles like wildfire over the weekend. Now, walking to her first period class, Amara could feel the ripple effect. Students who had never given her a second glance were suddenly finding reasons to look her way. Teachers smiled at her with a new awareness in their eyes, as if they were seeing her for the first time. She kept her head high the way her father had taught her, but her hands gripped her backpack straps a little tighter than usual. The weight of attention felt heavy on her shoulders, like a coat that didn't quite fit. In AP Literature, she caught Jessica Chen, who sat 2 rows ahead, quickly minimizing a browser tab showing the Vasseur Atelier website. In Chemistry, her lab partner stumbled over simple instructions, suddenly nervous about working with her. By the time lunch period arrived, Amara felt drained from the constant awareness of being watched, discussed, dissected. The cafeteria was worse. The usual cliques and social boundaries remained, but now they all seemed to revolve around her like planets around an unwilling sun. The whispers followed her as she made her way through the lunch line, carrying her tray with careful precision. "I heard she was kicked out of some fancy store," one girl stage whispered to her friend. "No way, that's not what happened. My cousin works at Bergdorf's and she said Vasser's daughter gave some expensive necklace to a random kid on the street. Please, my dad's in real estate. He says Vasseur probably bought the whole building just to prove a point." Each version of the story seemed more elaborate than the last. Some had her staging a protest. Others claimed her father had threatened to buy out the entire jewelry chain. None of them quite captured the quiet dignity of what had actually happened, or the complex emotions still swirling beneath her calm exterior. Danny was already at their usual table, practically vibrating with protective energy. Her dark eyes scanned the room like a security camera, ready to catch anyone who dared look at Amara the wrong way. When Amara sat down, Danny immediately leaned forward. "I swear, if one more person comes up to me asking if you're really Malik Vasseur's daughter, I'm going to lose it," Danny declared, stabbing her fork into her salad with unnecessary force. "Like, where have they been?" "You've been here since freshman year." Amara managed a small smile. "It's fine, Danny." "It's not fine. Did you see Madison trying to sneak a photo of you in bio? I almost threw her phone out the window." Danny's loyalty blazed bright and fierce, warming Amara despite the discomfort of the situation. "You can't throw everyone's phone out the window," Amara pointed out reasonably. "Watch me," Danny muttered, then straightened up as she spotted someone approaching their table. "Oh, hell no. Here comes Trevor with his stupid camera." But before Trevor could reach them, a voice came over the PA system. "Amara Vasseur, please report to the guidance office." The cafeteria fell silent for a moment, then erupted in fresh whispers. Amara stood up slowly, gathering her things. Danny started to rise too, but Amara shook her head slightly. This was something she needed to handle alone. The guidance office was tucked away in a quiet corner of the administrative wing. Ms. Patterson, the counselor, was waiting at her desk when Amara arrived. She was exactly what central casting would send if someone ordered a well-meaning but slightly clueless guidance counselor. Middle-aged, wearing a cardigan despite the warm weather, with reading glasses on a beaded chain around her neck. "Amara, please come in," Ms. Patterson said warmly, gesturing to the chair across from her desk. The office was decorated with motivational posters and college pennants, trying so hard to be welcoming that it somehow achieved the opposite effect. Amara sat down, her posture perfect, another habit learned from her father. She waited as Ms. Patterson arranged some papers on her desk, clearly building up to something. I wanted to check in with you, Ms. Patterson began, her voice gentle and practiced. Given everything that's been circulating about what happened last week, do you want to talk about it? The question hung in the air between them. Amara studied Ms. Patterson's face, the careful concern, the professional sympathy, the complete lack of real understanding. She thought about all the times she'd passed this office before, when no one had thought to ask how she was doing, about all the small cuts and dismissals she'd learned to handle on her own. You mean the racism, Amara said finally, her voice calm but clear. Or the fact that people only care now because my dad showed up? Ms. Patterson blinked rapidly, caught off guard by the directness of the response. Her mouth opened and closed once, like a fish suddenly finding itself on dry land. The carefully constructed script she'd prepared seemed to evaporate in the face of Amara's quiet honesty. The silence stretched between them, filled with all the things Ms. Patterson didn't know how to say, and all the things Amara had already learned not to expect. The counselor's well-meaning smile faltered, then recovered, but the uncertainty remained in her eyes. The city lights twinkled like earthbound stars through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Malik's home office. Papers were scattered across his mahogany desk, illuminated by the warm glow of his desk lamp. The leather chair creaked softly as he leaned back, rubbing his tired eyes. It was nearly midnight, but the work of running a global luxury empire never really stopped. Amara stood in the doorway, her shadow stretching across the thick carpet. She'd changed into her pajamas, soft cotton pants and an oversized t-shirt that had once belonged to her mother. Her hair was wrapped in a silk scarf ready for bed, but sleep seemed far away. Can I ask something? Her voice was quiet but clear in the late-night stillness. Malik looked up from his work, his expression softening immediately. No matter how busy he was, he always had time for his daughter. He gestured toward the chair across from his desk. Always. Amara padded across the room and settled into the leather armchair. It was too big for her. Her feet barely touched the ground, but something about being in this space with her father always made her feel both smaller and stronger at the same time. The familiar scent of leather and his cologne wrapped around her like a comfort blanket. She took a deep breath, gathering her thoughts. The question had been burning in her mind all weekend, through the social media storm and the whispers at school. Finally, she looked up at her father. You knew what they'd do when they didn't know me, she said slowly. Why'd you let me go in alone? Malik set down his pen and leaned back in his chair. The city lights cast shadows across his face, highlighting the subtle lines around his eyes, marks of years spent fighting battles most people never saw. He sighed, but it wasn't a sound of regret. It was the sound of a father watching his child face the same winds he'd weathered. Because I've lived it, he said finally, his voice carrying the weight of countless similar moments. And I wanted you to see what I've survived, so you know how to walk through it, not around it. The words hung in the air between them. Amara thought about the clerk's face, about the assumption of guilt before innocence, about the way invisibility and hypervisibility could exist in the same moment. She thought about her father, younger than she was now, walking into rooms where no one expected him to belong. Malik leaned forward, his elbows resting on his desk. His eyes were tired but focused, holding her gaze with the steady certainty that had built an empire. It wasn't your first time, but it was theirs. And now they'll never forget you. Amara felt something shift inside her chest. Not quite pride, not quite anger, but something in between. A recognition of power she hadn't known she carried. She thought about the little girl with the sunflower necklace, about the way small acts of dignity could ripple outward like stones dropped in still water. She nodded slowly, processing his words, then almost whispered, I don't think I want to be quiet next time. A smile crossed Malik's face, not his business smile or his public smile, but something more complex. It held pride and sadness, hope and memory, all wrapped together in the understanding of a father who had walked this path before. Then speak loud enough for those who don't want to hear, he said simply. The afternoon sun cast long shadows through the windows of Amara's school as she shouldered her backpack and headed out. Instead of turning left toward the bus stop, she turned right, walking down streets she hadn't visited in over a year. Her feet remembered the way even if her heart wasn't quite ready. The community arts workshop stood exactly as she remembered it, a converted warehouse with brick walls covered in vibrant murals. The front window still had the same rainbow handprints pressed against the glass, though some had faded with time. A bell chimed softly as she pushed open the heavy door. The familiar smell of paint and clay hit her immediately. Acrylic, oil, turpentine, and that distinct earthiness that always reminded her of her mother. Elena had spent countless weekends here, teaching art to neighborhood kids who couldn't afford private lessons. Amara used to sit in the corner with her own sketchbook, watching her mother move from easel to easel, offering gentle guidance and warm encouragement. The main room was alive with activity. Kids sat at tables scattered around the space, some bent over drawings, others molding clay with focused expressions. Paint-splattered smocks hung from hooks on the wall, and the afternoon light streamed through the high windows, catching dust motes that danced in the air like golden glitter. Amara's throat tightened as she walked deeper into the space. The walls were covered with artwork, not the polished pieces you'd find in galleries, but raw, honest expressions from young artists finding their voice. There were portraits of grandmothers cooking in tiny kitchens, scenes of street festivals bursting with color, and abstract pieces that spoke of dreams and determination. A mural stretched across the back wall, obviously painted by multiple hands. It showed a neighborhood scene, brownstones and bodegas, fire escapes draped with flowers, and faces of all colors looking out windows and walking down streets. In one corner, Amara recognized her mother's distinctive style in a small detail. A woman teaching a child to hold a paintbrush, both figures glowing with shared joy. "Amara?" a voice called from behind her. "Amara Vasseur?" She turned to find Ms. Ruby, one of the longtime staff members, standing there with wide eyes and a wider smile. The older woman's hair had more gray now, and her apron was as paint-stained as ever, but her eyes still sparkled with the same warmth Amara remembered. "We wondered when you'd find your way back to us," Ms. Ruby said softly, pulling Amara into a gentle hug that smelled of lavender and linseed oil. "Your mama always said you would, when you were ready." Amara hugged her back, surprised by how much she'd missed this place, this sanctuary of creativity and acceptance where no one cared about designer labels or family names. Here, the only currency that mattered was imagination and heart. Ms. Ruby pulled back, studying Amara's face. "You look just like her, you know. Same fire in your eyes." She reached into the pocket of her apron and pulled out a small key attached to a faded purple ribbon. "Elena left this here for you. Said one day you'd come back, and when you did, you'd need to see what she'd saved." The key felt warm in Amara's palm, its weight both familiar and strange. She recognized the ribbon. It was the same one her mother used to tie back her hair when she painted. "Her storage locker's still in the back," Ms. Ruby explained, gesturing toward a hallway. "We've kept it just as she left it. Take all the time you need, honey." Amara walked down the narrow hallway, past shelves stacked with supplies and works in progress. The storage lockers lined the back wall, tall metal cabinets that held artists' personal collections. Her mother's was number 16, just like Amara's current age. The key slid into the lock smoothly, as if it had been waiting for this moment. When Amara pulled open the door, the scent of her mother washed over her. Oil paints, coffee, and that particular perfume she always wore that smelled like vanilla and spice. Inside, canvases were carefully stacked against the walls. Amara pulled them out one by one, her hands trembling slightly. Each one was a self-portrait, but not the kind meant for public display. These were private moments captured in paint. Elena angry, her brush strokes bold and sharp. Elena laughing, colors swirling with joy. Elena exhausted, shadows under her eyes but determination in her jaw. Elena defiant, staring out of the canvas with unflinching strength. They were more than paintings. They were diary entries in color and texture, documenting the journey of a black woman making her way through a world that didn't always want to see her. Some had dates written on the back in Elena's flowing handwriting, along with simple phrases: "After the gallery rejection," "The day I got the teaching grant," "When the critic said my work was too ethnic," "The morning Amara first picked up a brush." Near the bottom of the stack, Amara found a larger canvas that made her breath catch. It showed her mother standing before a mirror, her natural hair free and magnificent around her face like a crown. Her posture was strong, shoulders back, chin lifted, not in defiance this time, but in pure self-acceptance. Behind her ear, a single sunflower bloomed, its yellow petals catching imaginary light. The date on the back was just 2 weeks before the accident. Amara's fingers traced the brushstrokes, feeling the texture of the paint her mother's hands had laid down. The sunflower was the same as the necklace she'd given away, a symbol of turning toward the light, of growing tall despite the shadows. "I remember," Amara whispered, her voice barely disturbing the dust motes floating in the storage room's dim light. She remembered watching her mother paint this very piece, remembered asking why she always included sunflowers in her self-portraits. "Because they're beautiful," Elena had said, "and they're not afraid to take up space." Amara trudged up the stairs to her penthouse floor, her arms full of her mother's canvases. The security guard had helped her carry most of them up, but she'd insisted on taking the last few herself. These weren't just paintings, they were pieces of her mother's soul, and they deserved gentle hands. The apartment was quiet when she entered. A warm glow from the kitchen suggested her father was still working late, the soft clacking of his laptop keys a familiar evening soundtrack. She made her way down the hallway, the plush carpet muffling her footsteps. When she reached her bedroom door, something caught her eye. A cream-colored envelope lying on the floor, partially slid beneath the door. Her name was written across the front in her father's distinctive handwriting, each letter carefully formed with an elegance that seemed at odds with his usual quick, efficient manner. Amara balanced the canvases against the wall and picked up the envelope. The paper was thick, expensive, the kind her father used for important contracts and formal correspondence. Her fingers traced the edges of the sealed flap as she pushed her door open with her shoulder. Her room was bathed in the soft amber light of sunset streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows. She set the canvases down carefully next to her easel, then sat cross-legged on her bed, the envelope heavy in her hands. For a moment, she just stared at it. Her father wasn't the type for letters. He was all about quick texts, efficient emails, or brief voice notes left while rushing between meetings. Written words, especially personal ones, weren't his style. Whatever was inside must be important enough to break his usual patterns. Taking a deep breath, she slid her finger under the flap and opened it. Inside was a single sheet of the same cream-colored paper, covered front and back with her father's handwriting. The ink was deep blue, and she could see places where he'd pressed harder with the pen, as if emphasizing certain words carried more weight than others. "Amara," the letter began, "there are some things a father hopes his daughter will never have to learn, but there are other things we know you must face because the world won't let you avoid them." She shifted on the bed, pulling her knees up to her chest as she continued reading. "I was 17 when it first happened to me. Not the first time I experienced racism, that came much earlier, but the first time I felt that particular kind of shame they reserve for us in their expensive stores." Amara's breath caught. She'd never heard this story before. "I'd saved for months working after school at my uncle's barbershop. Every dollar went into a tin can under my bed, until I had enough for a watch from Marshall's department store. Not a luxury watch like the ones we sell now. Just a simple silver timepiece that cost exactly $212. The writing grew slightly darker here, the pen strokes more deliberate. "I remember everything about that day. The weight of the money in my pocket. The shine of my shoes that I'd polished that morning. The way I'd practiced asking to see the watch, making sure my voice would sound right. Educated, proper, acceptable." Amara could picture it clearly. A young Malik, trying so hard to be perfect, to be beyond reproach. The clerk's name tag said Richard. He had a smirk that I still see sometimes in my dreams. He followed me around the store, not even trying to hide it. When I finally asked to see the watch, he said they were having inventory issues and suggested I try the discount store down the street. There was a small smudge in the ink here, as if her father's hand had hesitated. I left without arguing, walked 6 blocks before I realized I was crying. Not because I couldn't buy the watch, but because no matter how perfect I tried to be, they'd already decided who I was before I opened my mouth. Amara wiped at her own eyes, surprised to find them wet. That day taught me something. Not just about how the world sees us, but about what we do with that knowledge. I could have let it break me. Instead, I let it build me. Every time someone underestimated me, I used it as fuel. Every door they closed, I built my own. Now I own buildings bigger than that department store ever was. The next paragraph started with a slight tremor in the writing, as if the words had been harder to put down. But watching you walk into that jewelry store, knowing what would happen, was harder than any slight I've ever endured. Because you're my daughter, and part of me wanted to shield you from everything I've faced, to make the world soft for you in a way it never was for me. Amara's hands shook slightly as she turned the page over. But you did something I never could. When they showed you their ugliness, you responded with grace. You saw past that clerk's prejudice to her daughter's future. You took humiliation and turned it into hope. Not just for yourself, but for that little girl with the sunflower necklace. Her father's writing grew softer toward the end, more reflective. They taught me shame. You taught me grace. I didn't protect you from it because I knew you'd make something bigger than rage. You have your mother's heart and your own kind of strength. And I've never been prouder to be your father. The letter was signed simply Dad, with a small heart drawn next to it, so unlike his usual swift signature that it made Amara smile through her tears. She read the letter twice more, letting each word sink in. Then she stood up and walked to her desk, where her sketchbook lay open to the drawing of the cracked sunflower. Carefully, she folded the letter and placed it between the pages, smoothing it flat. Picking up her charcoal, she turned to a fresh page. Her hand moved almost of its own accord, sketching the familiar lines of her mother's face from memory. But when she got to the eyes, she paused. Instead of drawing them as they were in the photos or her memories, she found herself sketching her own eyes, the same shape, but with a different kind of knowing in them, a mixture of her mother's gentle strength and something new that was uniquely her own. Across town, in a modest apartment in Queens, Linda Matthews sat at her scratched kitchen table, tissues scattered around her like fallen leaves. Her eyes were swollen and red, evidence of hours spent crying. The harsh overhead light made the wrinkles around her eyes more pronounced, aging her beyond her 43 years. The scholarship letter lay between her and her daughter Sophie like a bridge neither knew how to cross. Sophie's fingers traced the embossed letterhead of the Vasseur Foundation, the paper thick and expensive beneath her touch. The silence in their small kitchen felt heavier than usual, broken only by the rhythmic drip of their leaky faucet and the distant sound of traffic floating up from the street below. Linda couldn't look at her daughter directly. Instead, she stared at her own hands, studying the dry cuticles and chipped nail polish, anything to avoid seeing the disappointment in Sophie's eyes. The same eyes that had always reminded her so much of Sophie's father, with their amber warmth that could turn to steel when hurt or angry. Sophie picked up the letter again, her movements deliberate and careful. The afternoon light streaming through their kitchen window caught the natural highlights in her hair that, like many of her features, often led people to mistake her for white. It had been both a shield and a burden throughout her life, though she was only beginning to understand the full weight of that reality. The paper rustled as she read through the contents a second time. 4 years of college education, everything covered. Tuition, housing, books, meal plans. The kind of opportunity that had seemed impossible just yesterday morning. The kind of gift that changed lives. But it wasn't just a gift. Sophie knew that now. It was a message, wrapped in generosity, but sharp with truth. She looked up at her mother, who seemed to have aged years in the past 24 hours. Why would they do this for me? Her voice was soft but clear. After what you did to her? Linda's shoulders tensed at the question. A car horn blared from the street below, but neither of them flinched. They were used to the city's constant chorus of noise. This silence between them was louder than any traffic could ever be. Sophie watched her mother's face, noting how she seemed to collapse inward, like a building whose foundation had finally given way. The shame was visible in every line of her body, in the way her fingers nervously shredded the tissue in her hands. You know, Sophie continued, her voice taking on a thoughtful tone that made her mother finally look up. I used to pretend I wasn't black when I was younger. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with unspoken history, like it was something I could just opt out of. Linda's hands stilled their nervous movement. A police siren wailed in the distance, its sound fading like a long exhale. "You taught me to hide it," Sophie added quietly. The words weren't an accusation. They were simply truth, spoken with the kind of clarity that comes with finally acknowledging something long buried. The kitchen felt smaller suddenly, as if the walls were drawing in around them. The familiar scent of Linda's coffee, usually comforting, now seemed to carry a bitter edge. Outside their window, the sky was beginning to take on the purple-orange hue of early evening, but neither of them moved to turn on more lights. Sophie's fingers smoothed over the scholarship letter again, feeling the weight of its promise and its challenge. She folded it carefully along its original creases, each movement precise and intentional. The paper made a crisp sound in the quiet room. "If I accept this?" She paused, making sure her mother was looking at her. "I'm going to do more than study. I'm going to change what girls like her, like us, go through." Linda's eyes met her daughter's fully for the first time since she'd come home from work in tears, since she'd confessed what had happened at the store. In Sophie's face, she saw determination replacing the confusion and hurt of earlier. There was something else there too, something that looked like hope, but stronger. Linda nodded. It was a small gesture, barely perceptible, but it carried the weight of recognition, of acceptance, of finally getting something right after so many wrong turns. The gesture was simple, but in it, Sophie saw something she hadn't expected, the beginning of understanding. Not forgiveness, not yet, but a crack in the wall of denial her mother had built around them both. It wasn't much, but it was a start. A neighbor's door slammed somewhere down the hallway, making the thin walls of their apartment vibrate slightly. Sophie took a deep breath, the letter still in her hands. The reality of what this opportunity meant was slowly sinking in. Not just education, but purpose. Not just escape, but return with something to give back. "Mom," she said, her voice steadier now, "I need to know everything. About what happened, about why." She reached across the table, not quite touching her mother's hand, but close enough that the invitation was clear. "I can't move forward without understanding where we've been." Linda looked down at her daughter's outstretched hand, the same hands she'd once held as they crossed streets together, the same fingers she'd once bandaged after playground falls. The weight of all she'd tried to protect Sophie from, and all she'd failed to prepare her for, pressed down on her chest like a physical thing. The Saturday morning sun painted golden streaks across the weathered brick facade of the Hamilton Community Art Center. Amara stood at the entrance, canvas tucked carefully under her arm, watching early morning joggers pass by. The building hadn't changed much since her mother's days here. Same creaky door, same faded mural of raised fists holding paintbrushes, same smell of turpentine and possibility. Inside, the morning light filtered through tall, dusty windows, creating spotlight patterns on the worn wooden floor. Paint splatters from years past formed a kind of abstract history beneath her feet. Amara traced her fingers along the wall as she walked, remembering how her mother used to do the same thing, as if reading Braille messages left by artists before her. Ms. Jackson, the center's director, looked up from her desk and broke into a warm smile. Her silver locks were pulled back in a loose bun, paint-stained apron already on despite the early hour. "Elena's girl," she said, not a question but a recognition. "I was wondering when you'd bring something in." Amara carefully unwrapped the canvas. The portrait seemed to glow in the morning light. Her mother's face merged with her own, the brushstrokes bold and sure. Their shared eyes looked out from the canvas with quiet defiance, a sunflower tucked behind their ear where the two faces met. Ms. Jackson studied the painting, then Amara's face, noting the similarities that went deeper than paint. "You've got her fire," she said softly. "Different flame, same heat." Amara shifted the canvas in her arms. "I want to do a workshop, this afternoon, if there's space. For the kids." Ms. Jackson's eyes crinkled at the corners. "Baby, there's always space for a Vasseur woman with something to teach." The morning passed in a blur of preparation. Amara helped set up easels in the main studio, laying out brushes and mixing paints. She couldn't help but notice how some of the brushes were worn thin, the easels showing their age. Her father's foundation could help with that, she thought. But not today. Today wasn't about money. By early afternoon, kids began filtering in, some dropped off by parents, others walking in from the neighborhood. They ranged from about 8 to 14, carrying both excitement and uncertainty in their small frames. Many wore clothes with paint stains, badges of honor in this space. A girl about 9 years old, hair in perfect braids with yellow beads that clicked when she moved, pointed at Amara. "I saw you on TikTok," she whispered to her friend. "That's the girl from the store." Amara pretended not to hear, but she noticed how the kids gathered closer, their eyes holding questions they weren't sure how to ask. She took a deep breath, remembering her mother's first rule of teaching: meet them where they are. "How many of you have ever felt something so big you couldn't find the words for it?" she asked, looking around the circle of young faces. Every hand went up. "That's why we paint," she continued, gesturing to the blank canvases before them. "Sometimes colors speak louder than words. Sometimes a brush can say what your voice can't." The kids leaned in, entranced. Amara demonstrated mixing colors, showing them how red and blue could make purple, but also how adding more of one or the other changed the feeling of the color. "Like emotions," she explained. "They blend and change, but they're all real." As they began to paint, the studio filled with the soft sounds of brushes on canvas and quiet concentration. Amara moved from easel to easel, offering gentle guidance, just as her mother had done for her. A small boy with glasses too big for his face painted bold black lines across his canvas. "My brother got stopped by police last week," he said quietly, not looking up. "This is how it felt inside." Amara nodded, understanding the language of his strokes. "Keep going," she encouraged. "Put it all there." The girl with the yellow beads raised her hand suddenly. "Did you cry?" she asked, her voice small but clear. "When it happened at the store?" The room grew still. Even the youngest kids stopped painting, waiting for her answer. Amara looked at their faces, so young, yet already familiar with the weight of such moments. "No," she replied honestly. "I waited. Then I painted." She showed them her portrait, explaining how she combined her face with her mother's. "Sometimes strength looks like standing tall in the moment," she said, "and sometimes it looks like taking that moment and turning it into something beautiful later." The afternoon light began to soften, taking on the warm honey tones of approaching evening. Parents started arriving, but instead of rushing their children out, they stood along the walls, watching in respectful silence as the young artists finished their work. When it was time to clean up, each child carefully signed their painting. Amara showed them how to write their names with purpose, not just as a signature, but as a statement. "I made this. I matter." Ms. Jackson appeared with the ladder, helping Amara hang her portrait next to her mother's on the gallery wall. The two paintings seemed to speak to each other, Elena's wild-haired defiance complementing Amara's quiet power. Mother and daughter, different generations but carrying the same light. A woman with a professional camera had slipped in quietly during the cleanup. She raised her camera now, capturing the moment as Amara stepped back to look at the two paintings side by side. The shutter clicked softly, preserving the image of a young artist standing between past and future, her face illuminated by the last rays of sunset streaming through the windows. No one spoke. They didn't need to. The paintings said everything. About strength, about growth, about turning pain into power, about two generations of women who refused to let others define their worth. The little girl with yellow beads tugged at Amara's sleeve. "Can we come back next week?" Amara looked at Ms. Jackson, who nodded with a smile. "Same time next Saturday," Amara said. "Bring your truth, we'll paint it together." The auditorium of Riverside Preparatory Academy gleamed with polished wood and brass fixtures, a testament to old money and established privilege. Amara sat beside her father on the elevated stage, her posture straight but not stiff, wearing a cream-colored blazer over a simple black dress. She'd chosen to wear her hair in a neat crown of twists, elegant but unapologetically black. Malik, in his characteristic tailored suit, maintained his usual commanding presence. But today, he seemed content to occupy the background, his eyes fixed thoughtfully on his daughter. The moderator, Dr. Patricia Wells, stood at the podium with practiced ease. Her silver hair and pearls matched the school's aesthetic perfectly. Behind her, a projection screen displayed the event title, Breaking Barriers, a dialogue on inclusion in elite spaces. We're honored to have Malik Vasseur, CEO of Vasseur Atelier, and his daughter Amara joining us today, Dr. Wells began, her voice carrying that particular tone of academic authority. Recent events have brought important conversations about racial profiling in luxury retail to the forefront. The audience, a sea of pressed uniforms and attentive faces, shifted slightly. Some students pulled out phones, only to have teachers gesture for them to put them away. Mr. Vasseur, Dr. Wells continued, your response to the incident at Delacour and Rowe has been called both revolutionary and excessive. Would you care to address the business impact of your decision? Malik leaned forward to his microphone, but instead of answering, he turned slightly toward Amara. You invited us here, he said, his voice clear and measured, but she's the one who lived it. A subtle ripple went through the audience. Dr. Wells blinked, momentarily thrown off script. Amara adjusted her microphone. The sound echoed slightly in the quiet space. When she spoke, her voice was steady, neither confrontational nor apologetic. The first time someone followed me in a store, I was 9, she began. It wasn't about money, it was about history. Gasps scattered through the audience. Some students nodded in recognition, while others sat perfectly still, their faces frozen in that particular way that meant uncomfortable truth had landed. I was wearing my school uniform, Amara continued. The same one some of you are wearing now. The security guard still followed me through every aisle. My mom was waiting outside. She knew what was happening. She'd seen it before. Dr. Wells gripped the podium slightly tighter. This wasn't the polite, sanitized discussion of diversity metrics she'd planned. That day, my mom took me to the art studio. She handed me a canvas and said, "Paint how it feels." I used black and red and purple, colors of bruising. She hung it up right next to her own work. Amara's voice grew softer, but somehow stronger. That's when I learned that art isn't just about beauty. Sometimes it's about survival. In the audience, phones had begun to appear again. This time, the teachers didn't stop them. The students were recording, sharing, documenting a moment that felt real in a way their usual assemblies never did. Last week at Delacour and Rowe wasn't my first time being profiled, and it won't be my last, Amara said. But it was the first time I chose not to make myself small, not to smile through it, not to prove I belonged. She paused, looking out at the faces before her. Because I already belong. We all do, in every store, every school, every space, and if someone can't see that, that's their limitation, not ours. Dr. Wells tried to redirect the conversation back to safer territory. Perhaps we could discuss the scholarship program your father's foundation has implemented. Actually, Amara interjected politely but firmly, I'd like to hear from the students. This isn't about programs or policies. It's about lived experience. Who wants to share theirs? Hands rose slowly at first, then with growing confidence. Black students, brown students, Asian students, each with a story, each with a moment when they'd been made to feel less than. A girl in the third row spoke about being asked if she was lost when she walked into an AP class. Another mentioned being told her natural hair was unprofessional at a summer internship. A boy described shopping with his grandmother and having the sales clerk speak only to his white friend. As each student spoke, Amara nodded in recognition. She didn't offer solutions or platitudes. She simply witnessed, creating space for their truth. When the formal session ended, students began forming a line to speak with Amara. They moved down from their seats almost hesitantly at first, but with growing purpose. Black girls with stories in their eyes, brown girls holding themselves carefully. A few white students too, stepping forward awkwardly but earnestly. Malik watched from his chair, his expression soft with pride. This was his daughter's moment, not as a Vasseur, but as herself. From the back of the auditorium, a figure emerged. She moved through the crowd with purpose, though her hands fidgeted with the sleeve of her blazer. Her skin was light enough to pass for white, but her features held hints of her mixed heritage. She stopped at the edge of the stage. "I'm Sophie," she said, looking directly at Amara. "I know," Amara replied simply. The other students continued talking among themselves as Amara and Sophie sat down on the edge of the stage, legs dangling slightly. There was an awkward moment of silence. Then Sophie spoke. "I used to pretend," she said quietly. "When people assumed I was just white, I'd let them. It was easier." Amara nodded, not in agreement but in understanding. "My mom," Sophie started, then stopped. "What happened at the store? That could have been me. Should have been me, maybe." "It's not about should," Amara replied. "It's about now. What you choose to do now." They sat there, two girls raised in the same country, but with very different mirrors held up to their faces. Sophie's scholarship letter lay unmentioned between them, but its weight was present in the conversation. The late afternoon sun slanted through the high windows, casting long shadows across the auditorium floor. In the background, Dr. Wells could be heard trying to wrap up the event, but neither girl moved to leave. The autumn breeze swept down Fifth Avenue, rustling fallen leaves across the pristine sidewalks. Amara walked with her portfolio tucked under one arm, her steps measured and purposeful. The city had shifted into that golden afternoon light that made everything look a little softer, a little more forgiving. As she approached Delacour and Row, the familiar facade came into view. The windows that had once intimidated her now looked different, not just physically, but in the way spaces change when you've faced them down and come out stronger. The display cases that had once been crowded with luxury brands now showed careful curation rather than excess. The spaces where Vasseur atelier pieces had commanded attention sat empty, like punctuation marks in a rewritten story. The remaining items seemed to breathe easier, arranged with more thought than flash. Amara slowed her pace, not out of hesitation this time, but curiosity. Through the gleaming glass, she could see the interior had changed too. The lighting was warmer, less stark. The security cameras remained, but they no longer felt like accusations waiting to happen. A young black girl, maybe 7 or 8, stood inside with her mother. She wore pink butterfly clips in her hair and a backpack covered in superhero patches. Her small hand was wrapped tightly in her mother's as she gazed up at a display of delicate bracelets. The sight stirred something in Amara's chest, a memory of herself at that age, before she'd learned to brace for rejection. The new clerk, a young woman with kind eyes and natural hair, knelt down to the girl's eye level. She opened the display case without hesitation, without the hovering presence of security, without the subtle indicators of suspicion that Amara had grown so used to reading. The clerk's smile was genuine as she helped the little girl try on a bracelet, making it catch the light so the stones sparkled. Amara watched as the girl's face lit up, her reflection multiplied in the surrounding mirrors. Her mother wasn't tense, wasn't preparing for dismissal or disrespect. They were just customers, being treated like customers. The simplicity of it felt profound. Movement behind the counter caught Amara's eye. The former clerk, the one who had followed her, who had assumed the worst, who had learned the cost of prejudice, stood arranging items on a lower shelf. She'd been demoted from her prime sales position, now handling stock and basic floor duties. Her designer blazer was gone, replaced by a simple black cardigan. The woman looked up, perhaps feeling Amara's gaze. Their eyes met through the window glass. The moment stretched, heavy with unspoken words. The clerk's face showed recognition, then discomfort, then something else. Not quite shame, not quite understanding, but somewhere in the complicated space between. She didn't smile or wave or make any gesture of acknowledgement. Neither did Amara. They simply looked at each other, two people on opposite sides of a divide that was both literal and metaphorical. The clerk's daughter's scholarship letter existed between them, unseen but present. The memory of that day hung in the air like perfume, not quite dissipated, but transforming into something different. It wasn't forgiveness that passed between them. Amara hadn't offered that, and the clerk hadn't earned it. But there was recognition, of change, of consequence, of the slow, grinding work of growth. The clerk's humbling hadn't come from Malik's power or Amara's pain, but from facing her own reflection in the aftermath. The moment ended as naturally as it had begun. Amara adjusted her portfolio and continued walking. The click of her boots on the pavement matched the steady rhythm of her heart. She'd walked this path many times now between the store and the community art studio, but each time felt like reclaiming something, not just for herself, but for every child who'd ever been made to feel small in spaces that should have been open to all. The art studio welcomed her with its familiar scent of paint and possibility. Sunlight streamed through the high windows, catching dust motes in its beams. The walls were alive with new works, portraits, abstracts, scenes of city life painted in bold strokes and tender details. Before Amara could set down her portfolio, quick footsteps approached. One of her youngest students, Tiana, came running up to her, carefully holding a canvas in front of her. Paint still glistened wet in places, evidence of recent urgent creation. "I painted it for you," Tiana announced, her voice carrying that pure enthusiasm that only children can truly manage. Amara set down her things and took in the painting. A sunflower, bright, bold yellow petals reaching toward an unseen sun, pushed its way through solid concrete. The flower didn't break the concrete dramatically. Instead, it seemed to have found its way through naturally, inevitably, like truth finding its voice. The technique was raw, but the emotion was clear. The concrete had been painted in shades of gray that captured both strength and constraint. But the flower was pure joy, defiant in its beauty, determined in its growth. Looking at it, Amara felt the weight of everything that had happened since that day at Delacour and Rowe. The confrontation, the scholarship, the panel discussion, the quiet changes that followed. But mostly, she felt the ripples of impact, how one moment of standing firm could inspire others to grow through their own concrete. "For all of us," Amara replied softly, meeting Tiana's eager eyes. The words weren't a correction, but an expansion, an acknowledgement that every individual story was part of a larger one. Tiana beamed, understanding in that intuitive way children often do. She'd painted more than a flower. She'd painted possibility. She'd painted the kind of change that doesn't come from breaking things down, but from growing something new through the cracks in old systems. The sun had begun its descent behind Manhattan's skyline, painting the clouds in soft pinks and purples. On the rooftop of their luxury building, Amara and Malik sat in comfortable silence, surrounded by potted plants and sleek outdoor furniture. The evening air carried a gentle warmth, a last whisper of summer before autumn took hold. Between them, wrapped carefully in brown paper and tied with twine, lay a canvas that Amara had kept hidden in her studio space for weeks. Her fingers played with the string's edge, not quite ready to reveal what lay beneath. The city stretched out before them like a glittering carpet, thousands of windows catching the fading light. Malik sat quietly, patient as always, his suit jacket draped over the back of his chair. He'd left 3 meetings early to be here, but his phone stayed silent in his pocket. Some moments demanded full presence, and he'd learned to recognize them. The rooftop garden around them rustled softly in the breeze. Young plants reached toward the sky, their leaves dancing in the wind. In one corner, fresh soil had been turned over, waiting for new seeds to take root. Amara took a deep breath, her hands steady as she finally began to unwrap the canvas. The paper crinkled softly, like secrets being revealed. She worked methodically, the way her mother had taught her, careful not to tear, to respect the revelation of art as much as its creation. As the last fold of paper fell away, the portrait emerged into the evening light. Malik leaned forward slightly, his usual composure softening at the edges. The painting showed Amara as she was now, 16, strong, unapologetic. Her afro was painted in detailed brushstrokes that captured every curve and coil, a crown of natural beauty framing her face. Her eyes held the viewer's gaze with quiet confidence, neither challenging nor retreating. Behind her right ear, a single sunflower bloomed, its petals catching imagined light. The background wasn't the typical artist's blur of color. Instead, it showed fragments of spaces, a corner of the jewelry store window, a piece of the art studio wall, a glimpse of their home. Each place that had shaped her recent journey woven together in subtle harmony. Malik studied the portrait with the intensity he usually reserved for major business decisions. His eyes traced every detail, every choice of color and shadow. The silence between them felt full rather than empty, charged with unspoken understanding. After a long moment, he spoke softly, his voice carrying the weight of memory. "Your mother would have loved this." Amara's hands rested in her lap, no longer fidgeting. "She would have painted me stronger," she said, a hint of her old uncertainty creeping into her voice. Malik turned to look at his daughter, really look at her the way Elena used to remind him to do. "She would have painted you true," he corrected gently, "just like you did her." The truth of his words settled between them. Amara thought of her mother's self-portraits in the storage locker, how they showed every facet of her being, the strength and the vulnerability, the anger and the joy. They weren't perfect, and that's what made them powerful. The city lights began to flicker on below them one by one, like stars being born. A helicopter hummed somewhere in the distance. The moment felt suspended, as if the usual rush of New York had decided to pause and let this quiet truth have its space. Amara reached into her bag and pulled out her sketchbook, the one she'd carried through all of this. Its corners were worn smooth from being carried everywhere, its pages thick with the weight of recent months. She opened it to the first page where the cracked sunflower drawing still lived. The drawing had served its purpose. It had held her anger, her hurt, her process of understanding. But now, looking at it, she saw it differently. Not as a symbol of what had been broken, but as a marker of where the growth had started. Without ceremony or hesitation, she carefully tore the page from the sketchbook. The sound of ripping paper was sharp and clean in the evening air. She held the drawing up for a moment, letting the breeze ruffle its edges. Then she let go. The paper caught the wind, dancing upward before beginning its descent. It twirled and dipped, carrying away the weight of that first day, that first hurt, that first response. Not erasing it, never erasing it, but releasing its hold on her story. Amara closed the sketchbook, its remaining pages blank and waiting. Not a single crease marked its cover, as if it too understood this was a new chapter. No need for revenge or retaliation, no desire for spotlight or recognition, just the quiet certainty of growth as natural as breathing. The portrait leaned against the rooftop wall, its colors deepening in the gathering dusk. The city skyline glowed behind it, a testament to how beauty could exist alongside hard edges, how light could find its way through the densest spaces. In the corner of the rooftop garden, barely visible in the fading light, new growth pushed through the soil. Young sunflower shoots reached upward, their leaves still tender, but their purpose clear. They weren't planted for show or statement. They were planted because some things needed to grow, needed to bloom, needed to turn their faces toward the light. The wind carried the soft scent of possibility. Behind them, the city hummed its eternal song of motion and life. But here, in this moment, everything was still except for those growing things, reaching quietly toward tomorrow. If you enjoyed the story of Amara, I handpicked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to... If you enjoyed the story of Amara, I handpicked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.